All right, thank you so much for coming, distinguished colleagues, students, and community members. I'm honored to present a little of my research on the Mellah, the former Jewish quarter of Fez, Morocco. I'm particularly happy to share this information because this is the first time that my parents are hearing my research on Morocco. They came to my talk at the Getty and heard about my project on arts associated with the Sahara, but even though they have seen me go to Morocco since 2006, this is the first time that they're hearing about it. So today I want to focus on a city that is known for its living medieval qualities, and yet when we go into the Mellah, the former Jewish quarter of Fez, one of the things that we notice are examples of more modern architecture. And when I'm teaching, I often ask my students what's on the syllabus, what's missing from the syllabus, why are things missing, and so here we're talking about a city that is known as a living medieval city, and yet we're looking at architecture that is from the last 200 years. So this will allow us to think about the patinas of urban development, to think through minority space, and how architecture not only shapes the lives of the peoples who live in it, but then they also in turn shape how the architecture will look. And so I want to use my discussion today to talk about more recent histories in Fez that are less acknowledged, less talked about, sometimes difficult to talk about, but really reflect the variety of changes that occurred in the last century. So one of the things that you can see on these screens is you see two minarets. Those are the towers of mosques rising in the background. These banners were placed on a main commercial street in the royal quarter of Fez Jadid. And so we're seeing the prominence of the nation's Muslim identity, and this is the spiritual capital of the country of Morocco in North Africa, and the government and officials are deeply invested in the religious identity of the city and of the nation writ large. But we can also look into its only religious minority, into the Jewish community, and look at the rich contributions to Moroccan culture in that production. All right, so we're looking at the main street of the Fez Mellah. This was taken in 2010, and what you're looking at is a street that gives you histories from the 20th century. This was a quarter that was founded by the mid-15th century, but as you look at it, it appears much more recent. And as we're looking at the history of Fez, it's been said that Fez is a medieval Muslim city. It's a living medieval city. When we look at this street, it's less medieval. So we get to see the more recent histories and layers and changes and transformations. When we think about Fez, we look at a tripartite structure. So I want to take you briefly into the structure of Fez, and then we'll zoom into the Mellah. All right, so this is the Medina of Fez al-Bali, or Old Fez, that was established in 808 CE under the Idrisid dynasty. And there was always a Jewish community in Fez, the historic neighborhood. There wasn't a specific Jewish neighborhood, but there were a number of properties, particularly around the main mosque of the Qarawiyyin, and it's where they would depart from that center when they would move to the Mellah. All right, so we have the original city of Fez al-Bali, and then we have Fez al-Jadid, or New Fez. So this is the quarter that was founded in 1276 by the Marinid dynasty, and it was also the Marinid dynasty that established the Mellah as the Jewish city by 1438. So this is the tripartite morphology of the city of Fez, and will now go into the Mellah as an exceptional as well as integral part of that city. So this is a walled quarter. It covers 12 acres, and it is located just abutting the royal palace and the royal administrative quarter of Fez al-Jadid. And then we see its ramparts. Its historic ramparts were right here, and then it is above the Zaytun River. All right, so this has a spatial proximity to the royal palace. What did that do? That visually demonstrated the close relationship between the ruler of Fez, the Sultan, and his sole religious minority as a protector of them, but also that this was a community that had to adhere to a poll tax and a number of other restrictions. So we're seeing that spatial proximity between the royal palace and the Mellah, and we see that by the 20th century, the map you're looking at dates to the late 20th century, you're seeing a really dense structure. This area here was produced later in the 19th and 20th century. When we think about that spatial proximity and the relationship between a ruler and a population, that's not unfamiliar to my students in my African classes. So here we're looking at the map of the capital of the Kingdom of Benin, which was present in what's now Nigeria. And we see that we have the chief's palace, and there's what? We have artisans, wood and ivory workers, and we see the relationship of artisans to the ruler. Now, as we go back to the Mellah, the majority of this population were artisans. And so we can see that these were the primary goldsmiths and silversmiths, and also they had a monopoly on making metallic thread. So we see that the artisans are located also close to the ruler. All right, but we're looking at the settlement that is a walled settlement, and over a number of years, upheavals, aggressions directed towards the Sultan would often not go directly to the ruler, but they would first go through the Jewish quarter. So there were a number of upheavals in times of crisis. The gates of the Mellah would be closed, and it would become a city unto itself. So if we think about those three cities of the Medina of Fez al-Bali, of Fez al-Jadid, and the Mellah, all three of them could function as an autonomous city. They could close their gates either by necessity or desire, and still function as a self-sufficient city. So we have all of the resources I just said, which trades were particular to the Jewish community, but you can imagine that most of the other trades that would be present in a city were also available in the Mellah. So most number of trades parallel in the Mellah and the other cities, and then a few monopolies. We can also see that the architecture, the buildings, also paralleled. We just had trade and jobs and opportunities happening in all three sections. All three cities are also going to look very much alike. Muslim master builders are the ones constructing the buildings, and you can see on this map, this map shows property more than actual architectural structure, but you can see that there are a number of courtyards. So when we're looking at Morocco, we're talking about courtyard architecture, architecture that is familiar across the Mediterranean. As you go into the city, you see that on the street level, you have a proliferation of one-room stores. Now these are shops not unlike 7-Eleven or Walmart or any other store where you can get anything that you need in these one-room shops. So these are hanut, and you see wonderful produce in this slide, and the shops that are leading up right to the gateway in this one from 1911. This image by Burton Holmes. Burton Holmes was an American photographer. He went to Fez in 1894, and this trip was a first of a very long career presenting travelogues with these hand-colored slides. When I first went through these slides, the slides are owned by UCLA, so it's fortuitous that I was doing my research there. And I first looked through the slides and I saw brilliant colors, and I knew that the colorist had never been to Morocco. So I thought, oh, she's exaggerating the color. And then I went back to Morocco in April, and I saw the wildflowers. The wildflowers of Morocco rivaled the wildflowers that we have here on a good year. So the color, while sometimes absolutely exaggerated, is often true. Yeah?
Can you see what's in the baskets for sale?
Well,
I'm just curious.
those look like potatoes or onions, right? And then this is green. When you go to Morocco, and I hope all of you do, there are wonderful produce in baskets similar to this on a number of the market streets. But from that detail, I cannot tell what green that is. One of the extraordinary things, you know, here on the Central Coast, we have wonderful artichokes, right? But in Fez, you'll see the greenery of the artichoke folded up like a massive celery, and people cook with that. I've never actually tasted it, but I'm very interested, eventually possibly to try. All right, so I don't know, but I can try to go into my original copy of that and expand it to see if I can tell. That would be good. All right, so we have these streets. These are along two of the main commercial streets, but there are going to be these hanut or shops along many of the residential streets as well. As we go back to the map, this is the main commercial street bisecting much of the quarter from the northeast to the southwest. And that's also similar to what the appearance of Fes El Bali is like. That really has two main streets that come together at one point, but the idea of a main commercial street bisecting the quarter is apparent in all three of the cities of Fez. So we go in commercial streets, again, all of those different trades and occupations happening here. We're focusing on the produce sellers at the moment. And then houses. So these houses are built with Muslim master masons. They're going to oversee a range of carpenters, and this is a wealthy residence. We're looking at, it's a multi-story courtyard structure. And you can see in this postcard the traditional opulent interior decoration. So when you're going to Fez, you see that we have beautiful multicolored tile work on the floor. As you go up from the floor, that tile work often continues, and then the tile work is going to shift into stucco, and the stucco is often painted with different color palettes reflecting different fashions that change over time. So we go from the tile work to the stucco, and then the roof, it's hard to see in that card, is wooden and carved carved and painted. So we have beautiful, stunning interior decoration that is similar to that produced in the Medina. But one of the things that you see that starts to change in the Mellah is because spaces are getting smaller and tighter, you start to see the decoration everywhere. So in some homes, there might be a space between the tile work and the stucco, but here you see a proliferation of it. All right. This is a slightly different map than the one that you've been looking at. And so here I want to take us in. We started off with the commercial spaces, then went into the residential spaces, and now we're going into the religious spaces. So not unlike other areas in the city, you have religious spaces permeating the quarter. At most points in the quarter, you're just a few steps away from a house of prayer. Now, some of these houses of prayer are entire buildings, and there's a few of them. I'll mention two later on, but a number of them are just rooms within a home. And we can see that we've been focusing on the ways in which the Mellah is similar to other areas in the city. Now, there are some distinctions. Some of the distinctions include that there is an aggregation of wealth. So elsewhere in the city, you are going to have different classes, different economic levels, all interspersed throughout the city. That didn't happen in the Mellah. As the Mellah developed since the mid-15th century, we saw that the wealthiest residents all tended to aggregate on this high street, Durb al-Fuki, which means high street. And that street, note where it's located right next to the royal palace. What did that mean? Remember that from my earlier map, I said that we started off next to the royal palace and then we descended down to the river. So that meant that as you got further and further into the quarter, and particularly here, which would have been some of the earliest habitations, some of the most cramped and close quarters, that would have had the worst air. So if you were located next to the royal palace, that meant that you were on the highest ground, you had the best air. It was the best place to be located. If you had the money, you were able to buy property there. Not only that, but you might create a synagogue within your home, so you didn't even have to leave your home for a place of prayer. The shops, other facilities would all be located on Durb al-Fuki, as well as any noxious factories or other symbols, those would be further away in those lower areas. So we have an aggregation of wealth, and then the other difference between the Mellah and the larger city is because of that limited space, we're going to have the courtyards devolve. Single families occupy one room. By the end of the 19th century, the density in the Mellah is the highest anywhere in the city, with about 35 people living in every house. So what we see is that we have wealth collected in one area, and we have buildings that are going to be taller and tighter than the rest of Fez. So you can imagine with that density that the cemetery is actually going to be your one open space. And so the cemetery isn't just a place for funerals, and we'll also talk that it's also a place of saint veneration and festivals and ancestor reverence. But it's also your place of recreation. This is where you are going to go on your day off and to have a picnic and relax and, of course, honor your ancestors. So here we're seeing another slide with Burton Holmes walking through the cemetery of the Fez Mellah. Yeah.
Palace in the background there?
No. Okay. So we're looking at the cemetery here, and you're just looking at the walls of the city. These are walls of Fez al-Jadid, and this is the Burj here. So let me go back to that map. So right then, we were looking at a view, I believe, going this way. And you were looking at that big tower rising up. There was a tower here, and there was a tower over here. So you're looking at the defensive fortifications extending from the Mellah to Fez al-Jadid. Thanks for asking. Oh. All right, so we had the relationship of the main commercial street, the high street, where the wealthy are located, and now we're looking at this map where all of the 14 known synagogues in the end of the 19th century were located. In times of crisis, and we'll be moving more into times of crisis, Muslim authorities could ask the Jewish community for their prayers. And so in times of crisis, the rabbinical court could ask the entire community to fast and to have a procession. What they would do was they would have morning prayers at their home synagogues. They would then meet in the original cemetery that prior to the late 19th century was located over here. And they would have prayers over the graves of the saints, and they would have a sermon by one of the grand rabbis. They would then process all through the main street of the Mellah to this watchtower, which is called Burj. That watchtower held relics of martyrs that died in riots in 1465. And so they went to that site, and it was thought that the prayers given at the site that in the space that was imbued by those relics were stronger than if they were said elsewhere. The community then backtracked over half of the quarter and then went to the Abendanen synagogue. So here we see that they went to the Burj, and then they went to the Abendanen synagogue. So this is one of those synagogues that was an entire building. It was a synagogue founded by the 17th century, and it was one of the synagogues that was so associated with the Danan family that had been in Iberia. So one of the older histories about the Medina of Fez, it was until the 18th century, it was a divided community. There were those who were indigenous Moroccan Jews, and there were those who were descended from those expelled from the Iberian Peninsula between the 13th and 15th centuries. Those two communities had different languages, and they had different religious practices. Those communities didn't coalesce until the 18th century, when the indigenous language of Judeo-Arabic became the dominant language, and the Sephardic rites of those that came from the Iberian Peninsula became the major rites in many of the synagogues. So we have this synagogue that was related to the powerful families that had been expelled from Iberia. And then there would be an afternoon prayer at the same synagogue. So that was an event that could happen in times of crisis, and those times of crisis happened for the larger community and for the Jewish community in particular. In 1912, we have the formalization of Morocco's colonial experience as a French protectorate. The Treaty of Fez was signed March 30th, 1912, and this is what happens April 17th through 19th. We see that the Moroccan army had new rules. They were told to carry backpacks. They were told to take orders in French, and they were told to take a pay cut. This did not make the Moroccan army happy, and they mutinied against their French officers. But instead of going against the Sultan, who was no longer in official power, they went after the Jewish quarter. And why did they do that? Fassi Jews from Fez, were not the ones asking them to hold backpacks, have a pay cut, and answer to calls in French. But that shows us that in 1912, the Jewish community was seen as potentially benefiting from French rule. Now, they had reason to believe that because in the decades leading up to colonization, as increasing foreigners, European foreigners were coming in, where were they sent? They were sent to stay in the Mellah. Why were they sent to stay in the Mellah? Well, the Mellah is next to the royal palace. They can be easily surveilled and seen. They can have access to more facilities in the Mellah than they would elsewhere in the city. So it was the Mellah where we started to see Europeans buying property, opening establishments, and so there was a European presence here already, and that also contributed to leading to the attack on this site. But we can also look at this postcard as a cultural document. You look into the rubble, and this is on the main street, and you can see the wonderful tile work and the traditional architecture that was filling the Mellah. All right, so in the beginning of Fez's colonial experience, we have a site that already has infrastructure in place, but it needs restoration, right? It needs repair. So this was a site that could be quickly rebuilt, and that would become a site that could be, until a new modern European city was built, this could serve as an intermediary. So now let's bring back the map, but you notice that I've now uncovered the rest of Fez. So you're now seeing that Fez extends into a city that looks a lot different, with straight roads. And this is the Ville Nouvelle. This is the European city that was begun in the Protectorate period. But the city wasn't built until 1916, and we're still in 1912. So after 1912, we start to see the main street be restored. This main street has lots of variation in its architecture. We're seeing, and here it looks like a building is still under construction. This is circa 1917, given the date on the back of the postcard. But we see a variety of balconies and facades. There's even a great neoclassical facade further down the main street. So what you're seeing is a great degree of individuation that doesn't occur elsewhere in the indigenous city. So we're seeing in the 19-teens that residents are trying out new identities. They want to participate in a new modernizing society, and that's evident in their architecture. Now, that architecture is also doing something else. With those balconies, it means that residents are not forced into cramped interiors, but they're now looking out onto a more open space in the street. The street becomes a theatrical space, a spectacular space, and also there's more light coming into their buildings. So here we're looking at the Burj, so we can imagine that last postcard was taken from the tower looking down the street, and now we're looking back towards the tower. And you can see the range of balconies on the street and all of the shops that are open. Okay, so as we're moving forward, we've moved from 1917 through 1938 here. Lots of changes are happening in Fez, and that means that in the late teens and early 20s, we actually have cars and automobiles coming down this street. There's a postcard of the first car in Fez in 1913. You can imagine it's going to be very congested if you have pedestrians and cars on this street. So we start to see other developments. So this was at one end of the quarter at the Burj, and here it's this plaza that had originally been the cemetery. It's now opened up into an area that includes hotels, cafes, car rentals, and other tourist facilities. So it's here that tourists coming to, officials coming to Fez would be able to find all of the necessities they wanted to prepare to have their touristic adventure into the rest of Fez. So the rest of Fez in the Protectorate period was supposed to be preserved, right? But as we just saw with the Mellah, we had lots of development and lots of changes, right? So at different times, the Mellah of Fez is going to be considered European, and sometimes it's going to be considered Fassi Moroccan. And so as we move through the Protectorate period, it's been suggested that if you need to rebuild your house, and it was rebuilt in that European style, when you rebuild it, you should rebuild it in a more traditional style, but that rarely happens. As we see the development continuing in the Protectorate period, we need to have more developments to accommodate new travelers. And an opportunity presents itself in this corner of that plaza that I just showed you, the Place du Commerce. This is the corridor of Bou Kississat. Here we see the walls of the palace and all of the new developments happening in the Fez Mellah. This area is going to be widened into a street. And so here we've been looking at images of the commercial street of the Mellah. But here is that corridor of Bou Kississat that's going to be widened in 1924, and it's going to have a corollary development with the widening of the main street of Fez Jadid. So with this opening, and here you can see the buildings of the palace, there's that Place du Commerce that we were just looking at images of the hotels. These structures here are actually schools that were built. And so what we're seeing here is with this new construction of the avenue, it's going to mean that cars no longer have to go down the street. They're going to go through here. But what does that also do? That means that they are going to circumvent the Mellah. They're no longer going to go through it, but they're going to go around it. And so that's going to create an ever widening wedge between the royal palace and this quarter. The street is going to open in 1926, and in 1927, land has been expropriated and a number of apartments are built on it. These apartments are addressing one of the main issues in the 1920s, which is a housing shortage. And yet, as you're looking at these were developed as a charitable venture, but they also change how we look at this quarter. Because as you look at the housing development, you see a standardization, you see a regularization that looks very different from all of the individualization that you saw in the 19-teens development on the main street of the Mellah. And so it's this quarter, and we can see that it's a narrow strip of land, so there's no courtyard architecture in these apartments. And what's more than that, the interiors are not filled with the tile work and the stucco work and the woodwork that you expect to see. But on the exterior, you see all of that delightful woodwork and wrought iron railing. So the decoration is on the exterior instead of the interior. It's this avenue that was published by a wonderful architectural historian. Her name is Gwendolyn Wright. She's done fantastic work, but she used Bou Kississat to say that there was a fundamental morphological difference between residences in the Mellah and residences in elsewhere in the city, in the Muslim city. And that's true if you're looking at this particular set of apartments, but those apartments were developed in the 1920s, so they are very temporally specific. And here we see, there's that building that I mentioned earlier with the classical elements. And here you see that one of my friends actually lives on Bou Kississat. When I was in Morocco in August, this is where I stayed for my first night. So these are the faces of the Mellah. In the 19-teens, we had this great individualization, and here we have this homogenization in the 1920s. So oftentimes in this push for modernization, there's oftentimes a parallel decrease in religious practice and identity. That doesn't happen in the Mellah because it's in the late 19th century and continuing into the 20th century that we really see a rise in the cult of the saints. So we're looking here from the rooftop of the synagogue of Benin, looking out over the Mellah, and it's this site where synagogues are going to have more orthodox, somber practices of prayer. In the cemetery, in that one open space, we are going to have festivals and revelry. And so I need you to use your imagination to repopulate this site with ecstatic practices, because I don't have images of the events that I'm about to narrate. So we're going into the cemetery, and the cemetery in the Fez Mellah has multiple tombs of saints. If you are going to visit the tombs of saints, you are going to visit all of them in the cemetery, and you would start off with the most important. This is the most important saint, our 18th century Rabbi Judah ben Attar. And you can see that even in the 21st century, that multiple adherents are still lighting candles or oil at his grave. There are a number of other saints. I just want to quickly mention one whose tomb is right next to Rabbi Judah ben Attar, Lala Solika. Solika was a woman who was born in Tangier, and she was executed in Fez in 1834. Her death resonated with both Jews and Muslims, and they would all come to pray at her tomb. We see this shelter that was erected for pilgrims. So there are a number of options. You might be going directly to ask for one saint to intercede. You might do that monthly, but one of the main practices was to go to the saint's tomb on the anniversary of their death. This was called a hilulah, or hilulat plural. These were multi-day festivals that combined the entire community. You had soiled rags mixing with luxurious clothes. All of these community members were coming together to celebrate these saints. These events were seen as heterodox practices, and they celebrated the plurality of Jewish experiences, particularly as the colonial order was weakening. And certainly the colonial administration would start to try to govern these practices and make sure that they weren't so highly visible, that they weren't causing disorder in the cemetery. But we can see that this was one of those practices that enlivened the quarter and still enlivens the quarter. By the mid-20th century, most of the Jewish community was emigrating out of the quarter, of Fez, and of Morocco writ large, particularly after the 1967 Six Days War. So even after this quarter no longer had a Jewish majority residents, the cemetery remains a potent source of Jewish consciousness. And we can see that those hilulat are continuing today. These two are actually in a different site, but you can see the candle auction that is opening the hilulah and the candles lit during one of these festivals. This practice was something that I just presented on a few weeks ago at a conference in Morocco. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So as the quarter becomes not a Jewish quarter, but a Muslim quarter, changes start off small. Muslims are going to buy most of the houses of prayer. This is was a former synagogue, now it's a house. And the other largest synagogue, not the Abendanen, but the synagogue Al-Fasiyin, became a boxing ring after it closed in 1970. Now, in the Ville Nouvelle, there was still a synagogue operating, but all of the ones are going to close in the Mellah. So we're seeing here that as we move into the contemporary period, the Mellah loses its autonomy. Those stores are going to close, and you're still going to be able to buy things. You're going to be able to buy lots of cheap Western knockoffs. Some of them are even produced in Morocco, but you're going to have to go to other parts of the city to get the areas and goods that you need. And so here, comparing the aesthetics of the Mellah with its diverse individualized architecture along Main Street, and then the homogeneous architecture. This is looking down towards an apartment that I rent in the Medina, where you don't see any differentiation. So even though the Jewish residents have left, in the 90s, we started to see greater attention, greater heritage tourism, and it was that helped to restore the synagogue Abendanen that opened in 1999 with its restoration. There were a number of tourist groups coming through and bringing recognition to these sites. But such heritage tourism isn't going to benefit many of the residents who are currently living in the quarter. So I want to take you to my friend Abdul's apartment. His grandparents originally lived in this apartment with a Jewish family, eventually buying them out. It was also suggested that this also functioned as a synagogue at one point. Well, Abdul started taking in a host of international couch surfers. So you can imagine that in the 21st century, we have lots of guest houses, we have lots of bed and breakfasts, but a lot of young people who are traveling don't have a lot of money. So they might find Abdul's place on this network and go to his section. That's only going to work in the Mellah because it isn't a tourist destination. Fez is the only Moroccan city I know where tourist police actively harass Moroccans walking through the streets with Western tourists. You're supposed to be a licensed guide in Fez, and if you don't have that badge saying that you're a licensed guide, you can be thrown in jail. Now, just as I said, there were fewer banners in the Fez Mellah, there are fewer police actively patrolling the Fez Mellah. So this is a place where Abdul is able to take in Westerners because he's not going to be harassed. He had a job with a guest house in the Medina. It was much more difficult there. All right, so we're starting to see these shifting identities of the Mellah in the 20th century as we go into that area on the map that showed 19th and 20th century developments. That's where you see this great house that's stamped 1931. So think about that. Think about residents that want to proclaim, this is my house, I built it in 1931, it is modern, I am a modern subject. So presenting these new identities really takes us in to the failed modernization experiments in Fez, things that aren't recognized elsewhere in the city. And so I want to conclude by taking you into these current residents. So you're looking at Omar, who is one of the guardians of the Abendanen synagogue. He's happy to open it for you and let you see the site. You can also often go here and go have him or one of his family members open Synagogue El Fasayin down the road. And here looking at two of the residents that I got to know best, thinking about people as this site, it's no longer a living Jewish quarter, but it is still a living quarter, and it allows us to acknowledge all of these more recent histories that are less acknowledged elsewhere in the city's history. So thank you so much for joining me on this recent journey. Again, if you want to know more about older histories or certain areas of the presentation, I'm glad to answer any questions. So thank you. Bonnie.
Yes. What happened to the Jews? Did they leave en masse and go to Israel, or how did this process take place of the Jews disappearing, and how many of them are left?
Okay, so how many are left? The last time I had a count was 62, and none of them living in the Mellah. So living some in the Medina. One of those is my Jewish American friend, Bonnie. And then, so we have about 62 present. So the process of the Jewish community leaving. It's certainly begun in the Protectorate. Because what happens in the Protectorate, the capital moves, right? So the governmental capital moves to Rabat. The economic capital moves to Casablanca. In many other Jewish communities in Morocco, the community were merchants and those involved in the country's economy. That wasn't the case in Fez, but you had lots of people moving to join the administration in Rabat, and you had lots of Jews joining the trade and burgeoning economic communities in Casablanca. So those were the first moves. Once the Ville Nouvelle was built in Fez and all the other Moroccan cities, moved to the new town, right? So move out of the Mellah to the new town.
Why? Why did they move into the new town?
To have less density, right? So at the end of the 19th century, you have 35 people living in every building. So you want more space. Go have modern amenities. Have better access to water, so move to the Ville Nouvelle. So that's the first move. Second move is to Casablanca or Rabat, and then certainly to France, and then when Israel is created, moving to Israel. The other main destination is also Montreal in Canada. So the wave, and Dr. Stroll, I'll get to you just a second. So the waves of migration start slowly and then really precipitate in the 1950s and 60s.
But there was no expulsion.
No expulsion. And actually during the Vichy occupation during World War II, so I was saying that the Mellah's population in the 19th century went from 6,000 to 15,000. There were a number of major epidemics at that time that would plunge the population, as well as lots of waves of rural to urban migration. But during World War II, the population is going to explode up to 22,000 because Jews were being forced into Morocco. There were a number of camps in Morocco as well. Dr. Stewart, do you remember your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
What drives the economy in Mellah?
Not much. So it is a very poor region. It's a little too Moroccan for most tourists because the violence that pervades much of Moroccan society is very palpable there. So, right, all of the industry has left. That's why I was saying it has lost its self-sufficiency. Yeah, we don't have the metal workers anymore or the metallic thread that the main ones were there. There is still a Farron, there are still a number of shops, but mostly on the main street, cheap Western goods. On Bouquet Sassat, we have a number of shops that sell walnuts, apricots, all of the wonderful things that you do want to eat. So those are still working, but yeah, much of the industry is gone in the Mellah.
So that more affluent area that was closer to the palace, is that pretty much dissipated then?
Oh yeah, so right, that's been subdivided into separate apartments. This apartment that Sumia and Miriam's family lives in has been radically subdivided from whatever its original incarnation was, and they live just off. Let me go back to one of my maps. They live, so here's Durb al Fouki. They live on Durb al Duke, which I believe is this one right here. Yeah.
And their educational system then, has that also been depressed?
So unemployment in Morocco is way too high, but they do have a system of, I think it is fairly free university education. So I have lots of friends that were attending or did attend university, but that doesn't necessarily suggest that there are jobs. We saw Abdul, who was he was working for a foreign guest house. He had this side gig hosting couch surfers, but particularly men are highly unemployed. You see lots of women working in the factories doing textile work. So a lot of times women are the breadwinners in families. Yeah. Yeah, Sherry. Oh, Magnolia, sorry.
What's the population now?
What's the population of the Mellah?
Well, I'm actually thinking of Fez.
Fez.
But also of the Mela.
I don't know what the Mellah's current population is. That would be something to look at. Well, okay. So let me tell you about Fez.
Actually, my original thought was, what's the population of
Fez is over 1.5 million.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah. Over 1.5 people in the Medina proper. I think it's 150,000 in Fes el Bali, the Medina.
And in the Medina, they're much older. The architecture is much older in the Medina.
Well, it was founded in 808, and so one of the minarets of the Karawiyan, the mosque, does date to the 10th century, and there are architectural specialists who can show you the different fashions in architectural style, but I doubt there are many 10th, 9th century buildings remaining.
They're older than like 19th century.
Absolutely.
In the Mela.
So in the colonial period, right, you had restoration in the Medina of lots of those buildings, particularly the Marinid buildings from the 13th to 15th century. So we have lots of those buildings, particularly because they also had building booms during that period. So that's where we get the idea of it as a living medieval city, because there are all these 13th to 18th century houses. As the city itself grew, this area here was once considered the garden district, and that area really filled in the 19th century with those things. We don't have a lot of riads. Riads, those garden palaces, are more associated with Marrakesh and places like that, but this is the area in Fez that has those larger garden houses that really filled in the 19th century. But indeed, a lot of this, especially down here, right, between the 9th and 15th centuries. Yeah.
What's the political future?
Ooh, what's the political future? Well, there has been, the most recent news that I was hearing out of Morocco was that the king is divorcing. So I don't know what the...
There goes the alimony.
Well, so during the Arab Spring, right, there wasn't much fear in that Morocco would have revolution. But there still are these lingering issues with the high unemployment levels, and that continues to increase. When I was in Morocco and when I was in Fez in August, that was actually the first time that I ever saw security guards placed at the 2 restored synagogues. That's never happened on other trips. So things are changing, some for the better, because we now have 2 restored synagogues instead of 1, but we now have security guards. So I don't know, but there's a lot of contention. While protests, I've seen wonderful protests in Rabat that are some of the most organized, peaceful protests that I've ever seen. But I think that peaceful quality may be shattering a bit. So there are a lot more protests, and particularly at the government. Yeah, so not quite sure.
I think you referred to one of or more of the rabbis as saints.
Yes.
Could you explain that? I've never heard rabbis referred to as saints or having shrines.
Okay, so that is this extraordinary element of Moroccan Judaism, and this is what I just presented on at it was a conference about honoring ancestors in Africa and beyond. And so one of the traditions in Morocco that goes back centuries, but certainly continued to rise in the 19th and 20th centuries, was this practice of saint veneration. So I'm using the word saints. The plural word is tzaddikim. And so they are holy people. So I'm saying saints, but you could also call them holy people. So we saw the tomb of Rabbi Judah ben Attar, but not all saints are rabbis. So we saw Lala Soleika, a young 17-year-old woman. She gets to be a holy person, a saint. And we also have other women in the Fez cemetery who are also considered saintly. So it's a practice that we see in Fez, but it's actually atypical to have that many saints in the urban environment. Many of those saints' tombs, not unlike the Muslim tradition of Marabou, have shrines in rural areas. So this practice of saint veneration, they have those hilulat, or the festival. It's a multi-day festival, 3-day festival, honoring the saint on the anniversary of his or her death. But then other people, both Jews and Muslims, would go to individual saints to ask them for their benevolence. Like I said, that when they went on that procession to the Burj and said prayers at the relics entombed there, the same thing. If you gave a prayer at the tomb of a saint, it was said to be heightened more than if you gave that prayer at home or even in the synagogue. So it is really this fantastic practice. There was also one that brought people of different economic abilities together in some really ecstatic festivals. There was dancing, there was alcohol drinking, there was singing, and that all got regulated once there was a section of the municipal council started to oversee hilulat in 1947, I believe. Yeah. Does that answer some of your questions? Yeah.
I was in Morocco in February, and I got to visit a couple of the old synagogues, and I was struck by how well they're maintained. I mean, somebody is not only keeping the Torahs there and the artwork and dusting them. I mean, they were immaculate. So I'm wondering who's paying for that.
Who's funding it? So some of it is now coming from the government, and the king has said that all synagogues in Morocco should be restored. We'll wait and see if that actually happens. But right, this idea of restoration, sometimes it's local initiatives, sometimes it's individuals that had relationships with the former community that take it upon themselves, like you saw Omar. He is frequently at the Abandonan synagogue, but then it would be local communities, the diaspora, giving money, as well as I think even the German government has given some money for some of the restoration, but I'd have to go back into my notes on that. But yeah, it's coming from a number of different sources. Yeah. Which ones did you go to?
You know how soon you forget these things. I think one was in Rabat, and one was in Tangier.
Okay, so the one in Rabat and the one in Tangier are also going to be more recent ones. So the Fez Mellah is the oldest Jewish quarter in Morocco. So it was established by the mid-15th century. There's going to be a Jewish quarter established in Marrakesh in the 16th century, and there's going to be a Jewish quarter established in Meknes in the 17th century. In the 19th century, pretty much every community is going to build a Mellah. So most of the Mellah you see were founded between 1800 and 1840. So most of them are much more recent. And I was going to bring it in. We have a wonderful publication on synagogues in the Islamic world that grew out of a College of Art Association panel that we had 3 years ago. And I have to check, but I think there's an article on the one in Tangier, not the one in Rabat. And then I have a piece on these 2 restored synagogues as well.
Yeah, and these 2 definitely were 19th century.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, another one. What sparked your interest in the Mela in Fez, or is it something to do with synagogue architecture in particular, or something else that brought you to this area of research?
So I got to UCLA after doing my master's in Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, I was working on material culture associated with a spirit possession group in northern Nigeria. I knew I never wanted to go do my doctoral research in northern Nigeria. So I came to LA and I needed a new topic. I was taking my advisor's architecture and urbanism course at UCLA, and I needed a quarter topic, and I came across not this, but another postcard of the Mellah in ruins. Many of the postcard publishers in Fez were Jewish, and there are a number of postcards documenting what's called a trittle, this destruction in 1912. So I had this postcard, and the first article I found was an architectural history of the Mellah, but it stopped in 1912. So I wanted to know what happened over the next century. So that's what's really started my project, and I've been doing it ever since 2005.
Yourself researching further Jewish quarters elsewhere?
Nope, for now, I'm focusing on my teaching, and I have the second project on arts associated with the Sahara. So in May, I'm going to Dallas to talk at a symposium talking about interactions with different Muslim communities. I'll be talking about arts across the Sahara, mostly textiles. So that's my second project. But this one, I haven't actually published on much of the material that you saw today. We may have an upcoming African arts issue that I'll publish the work about the Saint Veneration, if it works with my schedule. And so I really liked this material, and I think I would like to eventually put it out as an article. I don't know when that will happen, but my other main interest is still in Fez, but it's these things that I've labeled the 19th and 20th century editions, and that's actually where Abdul lives along this southern wall. This quarter is called the Nawawil. Nawawil means huts. And so Nawawil were areas when we had this large rural to urban migration, that's where these extra urban developments were erected. So I really would like to work more on the Nawawil, but that would certainly take me back a number of more trips to get the research on that quarter. So that's where these projects are going. All right, well, thank you so much for spending your time with me.